He sat in the third pew, calm, silent, and hiding something unholy. She stood behind him, holding the truth, the grief, and a loaded gun. He was her son. But what he had done could not be forgiven. And what she did next would shock the nation. Welcome to True Crime's Altar, where every sin is punished, every betrayal has a cost, and every soul must answer to the truth. Like, comment, and subscribe, because these are the stories the guilty prayed would never be told. The gunfire echoed through the sanctuary like thunder cracking heaven's gate. It wasn't a robbery. It wasn't vengeance from the streets. It was a woman, poised, refined, and unshaken, who pulled the trigger. And the person she shot was her own child, her son, right there in the house of God as the choir exhaled their final note. But what the congregation didn't know, what no one could have known, was that she had just ended a hunt. One that began with a hospital room, unraveled through a sickening family secret, and reached its climax with a daughter left bruised, lifeless, and nearly unrecognizable in her own bedroom. And here's the part that will live forever in whispers and nightmares. Her son hadn't just come to that church to pray. He came with a mission, one that could have shattered more lives if she hadn't stopped him first. This wasn't about parenting gone wrong. It was about evil born in the living room, fed in silence, and left to rot until it devoured everything. In the spring of 2021, Nadine Graves collapsed at her job as a front desk clerk at Eastfield Elementary in South Carolina. Rushed to Midland Regional, doctors diagnosed her with advanced pneumonia and severe fatigue complications. She was hospitalized for nearly 3 months under careful watch. During that stretch, her teenage son, Julius, and her husband, Otis, only visited on occasion, citing long work hours and church duties. But her daughter, Kiara Graves, never missed a day. 22 years old, reliable to the bone, Kiara brought fresh clothes, asked the nurses every question, and sat by her mother's bedside through the loneliness. When Nadine was finally discharged and came home in early June, the house looked untouched. But the feeling was different. The air had thinned. The walls seemed colder. Meals were cooked. Bills were paid. Floors shined. But everything else felt wrong. Otis, once known for his constant affection and corny jokes, had turned distant. He spent most evenings holed up in the shed out back or staring at his phone in silence. Julius, now 20, barely spoke. He kept himself locked away in his room or out late without explanation. Kiara noticed it first. Even before Nadine settled back into her routine, her daughter could feel the atmosphere had shifted. She remembered how the house used to be. Family prayer nights, Otis leaving handwritten verses by the toaster before work, Julius dancing like a fool when gospel music came on. That house had love in its bones once. But now? Nadine tried not to overanalyze it. Still weak and recovering, she chalked it up to exhaustion. Otis had been managing the household on his own for months. Maybe he was just worn out. Maybe they all were. But one Wednesday evening, just shy of 6 weeks after she came home, everything broke open. Kiara got off early from her second shift at a soul food diner across town. Nadine was asleep. The house was quiet. She figured her dad was in the backyard workshop. Wanting to ask if he'd eaten, she opened the door without knocking. What she saw inside would never leave her. It wasn't vague. It wasn't questionable. It was graphic. It was real. Otis Graves, her father, was physically involved, intimately involved with her brother Julius. No confusion. No misunderstanding. She froze, heart pounding in her ears. She didn't scream. She just turned and ran to her room, locked the door, and cried into her pillow until the sun came up. She didn't go to work the next day. She avoided both of them. Nadine, still unaware, assumed her daughter was overwhelmed. 3 days later, Kiara finally broke. Sitting across from her mother at the kitchen table, her hands trembled as she spoke. She didn't water it down. She told the truth. Nadine sat motionless, her eyes wide and vacant. It wasn't just betrayal. It was something unspeakable. something blasphemous. Her husband. She stood up from the table and walked out to the backyard. Hours later, when Julius returned from wherever he'd been, Nadine confronted him alone. Otis was gone. What followed was brief, but it changed everything. She asked him point blank if it was true, if he understood what he was part of. She begged him to stop, to seek help, to change, to walk away before he destroyed himself and everyone else. But instead of remorse, he met her pleas with disgust. Kiara, peeking through the hallway, watched as her brother spat in their mother's face. Not a word, not an apology, just venom. Nadine didn't cry. She wiped her cheek and turned away, retreating to her bedroom without another sound. From that night on, the house was no longer a home. Nadine and Kiara barely spoke to Otis and Julius. Conversations turned to silence. Eye contact vanished. Otis kept disappearing for long hours, and Julius strutted through the hallways like nothing mattered. The warmth that once made that house sacred was gone, replaced by cold glares and air thick with secrets. The sin had rooted itself into the floorboards, and every step forward echoed a slow descent into ruin. By November, 2 months after the confrontation in the shed, Nadine filed for divorce. No long explanations, no dramatic announcements. She just walked into the courthouse and started the process. The papers were served quietly. She didn't answer phone calls from Otis's relatives. She didn't entertain the church gossip. She simply packed what mattered and left with Kiara to a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the north side of Charleston. It wasn't fancy, but it was peaceful. Meanwhile, Otis was hard at work twisting the narrative. To the congregation and neighbors, he spun a tale of heartbreak, how Nadine had changed during her hospital stay, how she'd become cold and withdrawn, how he tried to hold the marriage together but couldn't. He even implied that she'd been unfaithful. And Julius? He stood by his father's side, repeating the same lie to whoever asked. The community, blind to the truth, sympathized. Otis was still a visible figure at church, reading scripture, shaking hands, offering prayers. Nadine became the quiet one, the one whose name stirred judgment. Kiara was written off as confused. No one questioned why Julius, now a grown man, still lived under Otis's roof. No one asked why they whispered in the back hall after service. Nadine, now working part-time at a small family clinic near Goose Creek, never corrected the story. She carried herself with grace, but carried the weight of a secret that threatened to suffocate them all. Kiara, on the other hand, boiled with rage. The lies, the silence, the injustice of it all. She begged her mother to speak out, but Nadine refused. "It's too vile," she said, "and too dangerous." But secrets, like rot, only grow in silence, and the filth that had once hidden behind the garage door would find its way back into their lives. Otis and Julius continued their relationship, unchecked, unchallenged, and unchecked sin will always demand more. It never stays satisfied. Then came the night that started with blaring music, cheap gin, and the kind of choices that set lives ablaze. Julius had been invited to a private gathering in a rented townhouse just outside Columbia. It was one of those anonymous parties. Fast drinks, faster decisions. Girls came later. Escorts, 3 of them, arranged through one of Julius's friends. Names were rarely exchanged. Nothing was safe. No caution. No care. Julius thought it was just another reckless evening. But one of those encounters brought something with it. Back home, Otis knew nothing of the party. Their connection had twisted into something dark and codependent, but it was still built on secrecy. As long as Julius stayed silent, nothing else mattered. But months later, long after the divorce, Otis noticed something was wrong. Fatigue, night sweats, a cough that wouldn't quit. He thought it was stress until a life insurance screening flagged anomalies. More tests followed. When the results came back, the world inside that house imploded. Otis Graves had tested positive for HIV. There was no affair, no other woman, just one person, Julius. A sickness born of sin now pulsed through his blood. And as Otis stared at those results, the truth clawed through him like fire. When he confronted Julius, it wasn't a conversation. Julius, also feeling symptoms, had just returned from a clinic. His results matched. Otis didn't wait. He met him at the front door, gun in hand. Some betrayals are too monstrous for words. Julius didn't argue. He ran, barefoot, through the yard, past neighbors' cars, down the street. Otis didn't pull the trigger. Maybe it was hesitation. Maybe it was shame. But the threat hung thick in the air. Julius never came back. He hopped couches with friends for a while. But once word of his status spread, those doors closed. He had nowhere left to go. The home he'd come from was toxic. The streets offered no grace. And the judgment he'd earned, he now carried alone. So he reached out to the one person who might still listen, Kiara. At first, she ignored him. Then came the calls, the voicemails, the crying, the begging. He didn't ask for forgiveness, only shelter, just a place to sleep. Nadine was firm. Her first answer was a cold and decisive no. This was the same son who had desecrated her trust, spit in her face, and helped Otis smear her name. But Julius kept calling, and eventually Nadine relented. With strict rules, no going into Kiara's room, no guests, no loud music, no disrespect, and only for 1 week. He arrived with a single duffel bag, head down, eyes averted. Nadine spoke only to lay down the rules. Kiara didn't say a word. The living room became his space, an air mattress on hardwood floors. They thought the storm had passed. They were wrong. Some storms don't leave. They wait. By the time Julius lay curled on the air mattress night after night, Nadine had already begun spending more time with someone new, Dr. Langston Pierce, the physician who had overseen her recovery at Midland Regional. What began as a few check-in calls eventually grew into regular phone conversations, and soon those turned into dinners, then weekends. Langston, a widower in his late 40s with a grown daughter in college, hadn't dated seriously in years. But Nadine's calm strength pulled something awake in him. With every late-night talk and soft laugh over takeout, their connection deepened. Before long, Nadine was sleeping at Langston's house more than her own. It felt safe there, quiet, full of light and things that hadn't been poisoned. She'd begun to believe a new chapter might finally be possible. But back at the apartment, the silence between Kiara and Julius thickened with each passing day. He kept to himself. She avoided even breathing in his direction. Nadine believed time and boundaries would hold the peace, but she underestimated how quickly decay spreads in places once breached.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
The prodigal had returned, but not in search of redemption. Kiara, for nearly 8 months, had been pushing herself harder than most her age. Working mornings as a cashier at a corner grocery, then changing uniforms to wait tables at a late-night soul kitchen on the east side. She had a plan, get her own place, not because she didn't love her mother, but because she needed space, privacy, clarity, and distance from the heaviness that clung to that apartment like mildew. Every week, she tucked away a portion of her tips. Not in a bank. She didn't trust the system. Stories of people locked out of their own accounts or hacked mid-paycheck haunted her. Instead, she kept her savings old school, cash inside a heavy steel lockbox buried under folded sheets and shoeboxes at the back of her closet. It was her dream in a box. In just over half a year, she had saved nearly $4,000. She told no one, not even Nadine, but someone else found out. Whether Julius had been watching her routines or had gone through her room while she worked late nights, no one could say. But one Thursday night, while Nadine was at Langston's and Kiara was clocked in at the diner, Julius made his move. When Kiara got home that night, something felt off. Her closet looked shuffled, the bedding disturbed, the box was gone. Days later, investigators would track the money. Surveillance footage from multiple hotel lobbies and corner store ATMs painted a clear picture. Julius had taken Kiara's life savings and spent it on a week-long spree, booking high-end escorts across 3 towns, North Charleston, Somerville, and Hanahan. Every payment was in cash, every encounter anonymous. But theft wasn't his last betrayal. It was just the crack before the collapse. It happened the following Thursday. Kiara had just wrapped another 10-hour shift and returned home near midnight. Nadine was again at Langston's. What followed would be pieced together only after the fact, through bruises, broken skin, and a video no one should ever have seen. Julius had positioned a recording device, either his own or borrowed, inside the corner of the bedroom. It captured everything. Kiara walked into her room. Moments later, Julius followed. What the video showed next was both intimate and monstrous. He struck first, shoving her backward, tearing her dress. She screamed, struggled, tried to escape, but the blows kept coming. At one point, her head slammed into the sharp corner of a dresser. Her resistance weakened. Her voice cracked, then disappeared altogether. He overpowered her, assaulted her, struck her again and again, until she stopped moving. Until she never moved again. The footage lasted just over 20 minutes. The screen cut to black. When Nadine returned home 2 nights later, she smelled it before she opened the door to Kiara's room. She called 911, but could barely speak. Paramedics arrived to find Kiara's body partially covered by a sheet. She was bruised, her body exposed, and already cold. Julius was gone. The air mattress was deflated, his duffel bag missing. There were no signs of forced entry, no note, no phone left behind. He had vanished. Kiara Graves had spent her last days planning freedom, a place of her own, a future away from shadows. Instead, she died in the room where she once folded her dreams into cloth, and the one who took her life was the boy she once played tag with in the backyard. The police issued a statewide alert that Sunday. They pulled Julius's digital records, his texts, apps, social media accounts. But everything had gone dark. No withdrawals, no pings, no trail. Kiara's autopsy confirmed blunt force trauma to the head. Secondary evidence confirmed the sexual assault. The video, recovered from a hidden memory card, would never be released. But it was damning. The case was airtight. Julius Graves was now the most wanted fugitive in the state. Nadine fell into stillness. She stopped eating, stopped speaking, barely blinked. The apartment was cleared by cousins and friends. She moved in with Langston Pierce temporarily. He became her guide through the fog, handling arrangements, taking her to interviews, shielding her from reporters. And still, one question haunted them all. How could someone do something so unspeakable and simply disappear? Then came the phone call. It was a quiet Sunday morning. Langston had just finished an overnight shift at the hospital and was sitting in the break room sipping coffee when his phone buzzed. An old friend from his college choir days now worked tech at a large church in downtown Florence. "I think I just saw that kid they're looking for. Your lady's son. I swear he's here. 3rd row from the front." Langston froze. He didn't call the police. He called Nadine. He told her everything. She didn't ask questions. She walked into her bedroom, opened the dresser drawer, and took out the registered pistol she had kept stored since moving into the apartment. She placed it in her handbag, zipped it shut, and left. The church was only 15 minutes away. She parked 3 blocks down and walked. The sanctuary was already halfway through the sermon. The choir sat in quiet reverence. Ushers stood like statues. Then she saw him. Third pew. Black hoodie. Shoulders hunched. Hair a little longer. Face sunken, but undeniably him. Julius Graves. Nadine slipped into a pew 2 rows behind him, close enough to see his profile. She waited. As the pastor began the invitation for prayer, Nadine stood. She unzipped her bag, pulled out the pistol, and called his name. Julius. He turned slightly. 2 shots cracked through the silence. Chaos exploded. People screamed. Ushers dropped. The choir scattered. Julius collapsed. Nadine didn't run, didn't speak. She simply stood, arms lowered, weapon hanging from her fingertips. The act was done. She was arrested inside the sanctuary, minutes later. Taken into custody, held without bond. Over the next week, detectives tracked Julius's final movements. Footage placed him near the church 2 days prior. Inside his bag, they found a small black journal filled with scribbles and names. One name had been circled multiple times. A woman in the choir. She gave it to me, the page read. She's still singing. Law enforcement determined he had returned not to make peace, but to confront the woman he believed had infected him at that party. His plans were unclear, but his history was not. And Sharon Graves had acted before he could do more harm. She never gave a formal statement, refused press interviews. When asked if she regretted it, her attorney said she whispered, there was no choice. Back in Charleston, Otis Graves remained a ghost, no longer attending church. His secrets exposed. His silence now stained with sickness and shame. Both his children gone. His wife behind bars. All that remained was a name people spoke of in hushed tones. Kiara Graves was laid to rest quietly. A small service. No reporters. Just coworkers and cousins. Nadine was not allowed to attend. Langston Pierce stood in for her, delivering the final words. And with that, the last of the light was buried. A family once rooted in worship and tradition had become a parable of silence, sickness, and destruction. This is what happens when sin is shielded, when evil is tolerated behind locked doors, and when truth is too painful to speak until it screams in blood. The weeks that followed the church shooting felt like a slow descent into shadow. The news didn't make it to national headlines, but locally, the city of Florence couldn't stop talking. Word spread through barbershops, storefronts, prayer circles. A mother shooting her son during service, most thought it had to be a mistake. But those who knew Nadine Graves, even distantly, weren't so sure. She wasn't impulsive. She wasn't loud. And she never did anything without a reason. Langston Pierce became her mouthpiece, shielding her from media questions and nosy church folk alike. The apartment she once shared with Kiara remained empty. The rent was paid through the summer, but Nadine never returned. Her belongings were boxed and moved to a storage unit on the edge of town. Meanwhile, detectives continued to dig. They uncovered more than a motive. They uncovered a timeline. Phone records confirmed that Julius had been circling that church neighborhood for several days prior. Footage showed him walking up and down the side streets, sometimes sitting on park benches near the back lot. He had been waiting, watching. Inside his bag, officers found the black notebook, pages of scribbles, some incoherent, others bone-chillingly direct. Names of people from the church underlined repeatedly, most circled in red ink. One name, Monique Ardot, had the words "She sang while I bled" written beside it. It was her, the woman from the party, the one Julius believed had passed the virus to him. She had joined the choir 2 months ago. What would have happened had Nadine not shown up that day? What violence still lived inside him, waiting for a moment to erupt. Some sins don't die with the body. They linger in questions never answered. As the investigation concluded, prosecutors began preparing charges against Nadine. Second-degree murder was on the table, but there was hesitation. The district attorney, after reviewing the full police report, saw something different. He saw a grieving mother, a woman who had been pushed to the end of her rope, a woman who had lost both her children, one to violence, one to his own sickness. Behind closed doors, plea deals were considered, but the state wasn't eager to make her a symbol. Nadine remained in county holding. Her trial date was postponed twice. Each time, her silence grew louder. Langston came daily, sat with her during visitation, read her scriptures and news clippings. She barely responded. It was as though her voice had been buried with Kiara. Meanwhile, Otis Graves still lived on the west end of Charleston in the same house he once shared with Nadine. But he no longer opened the blinds. No more hosting deacons. No more second-row seating at church. When the truth came out, when whispers turned into facts, he lost his place. Congregants began to avoid him. Friends stopped calling. Some said they had always suspected something strange between him and Julius, but didn't want to believe it. Others claimed they had seen how he looked at his son in church and tried to pray it away. But the truth was now inked in court records. And in silence, he faded. A few months later, Langston received permission to retrieve Nadine's personal effects from the apartment. Among the items was a locked jewelry box she had kept hidden in her closet. Inside were photographs of Kiara as a little girl, birthday cards from years past, and a folded sheet of paper with Otis's handwriting. It was a letter, written years ago, addressed to Nadine. The ink had faded in places, but the message was clear. Otis had been battling dark urges since his early 20s. He had considered therapy. He had prayed. But he feared shame more than healing. He ended the letter with a line that would echo forever. What's hidden can't hurt if no one looks. And no one's looking. But evil thrives when no one looks. And one day, it demands to be seen. The paper was never shared publicly. Langston folded it again and placed it in his jacket pocket. What could have been done differently? What could have stopped it all before it began? Those questions haunted everyone who touched the case, from the nurses who remembered Nadine's calm demeanor to the detectives who watched that damning footage of Kiara's final minutes. Even the judge, weeks later, privately told the clerk that the tragedy was like a sickness that grew unchecked. Because no one believed the first warning signs. That summer, a memorial bench was installed at Kiara's old workplace, the grocery store where she rang up customers every morning with sleepy eyes and a polite smile. Her manager paid for the plaque out of pocket. It read, "In memory of a daughter who loved deeply and worked hard for a future she never got to see." No press, no crowd, just a few coworkers standing under a cloudy sky. Langston attended, alone. Nadine was still behind bars, but her name remained absent from headlines. By early fall, plea negotiations reached a quiet end. Nadine agreed to enter a mental health facility for long-term observation in lieu of prison. It wasn't freedom, but it was something else. A place without locks, without cells. A place where silence didn't feel like punishment. She didn't speak much. Not to the staff, not to the other patients. But one afternoon, a therapist brought her a blank notebook and a pen. She wrote one line. "I held both my children in my arms when they were born, and I buried them both with the same hands." And that was it. No one ever heard her raise her voice again. The house on Holleridge Drive, where it all began, was eventually sold. The new owners never learned what happened there. They planted flowers in the front yard, painted the door blue, put up wind chimes. But sometimes at night, The neighbors still say they hear crying coming from the shed out back. The story of the Graves family faded from headlines, but it remained alive in whispered conversations, cautionary sermons, and the quiet grief of those left behind. Some say Nadine was a mother pushed beyond her breaking point. Others say she simply did what the law wouldn't. But whatever the judgment, one truth stands firm. Silence killed that family long before any bullet did. What happened in that home was not just immoral. It was a failure of accountability, a failure to speak up, a failure to protect. And when sin is left to fester behind closed doors, it mutates, it consumes, and eventually it destroys. To this day, the tape from Kiara's room is sealed in evidence, unwatched by the public, filed under restricted access. But investigators who've seen it say it's not just disturbing, it's a cry from a soul snuffed out too soon. A young woman who tried to survive the weight of secrets no one should have had to carry. And Julius Graves? His name is never spoken in the church where he last sat. The pew remains unclaimed, and the carpet beneath it replaced. Otis Graves, now confined to hospice care and rarely lucid, is visited only by nurses. His name, once read aloud during prayer meetings, has disappeared from all mentions. No one brings him communion. No one calls. He lives surrounded by photos of a family he destroyed. And Nadine remains in quiet care at the Midlands Behavioral Institute. She tends to a garden on the south lawn, waters the herbs, prunes the dead leaves, never speaks of the past. Only once, when a nurse asked her if she missed her daughter, she replied softly, "Every day, even now." She never speaks of Julius. Some stories don't need sequels. Some need silence, reflection, and repentance. And now, to our viewers. If you are experiencing darkness in your home, in your relationships, in your mind, do not carry it alone. Secrets protect no one. Sin thrives in silence. But healing, real, life-saving healing, begins when you speak, when you reach out, when you refuse to let shame write the ending. Protect your children, honor truth, and never look away from what's hard to face. Because if someone had listened sooner, Kiara might still be alive. This is True Crime's Altar, where every sin is punished, every betrayal has a cost, and every soul must answer to the truth. Tell us, what are your thoughts on this story? Do you believe Nadine was justified? Or did she become the very thing she tried to stop? Comment your opinion below, and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story if you believe these truths should never be buried.